So, greetings, hello, blessings. Today's the 24th of May, it's Sunday. It's my normal kind of fasting for peace day, and this is a custom I've been doing, recording a talk. I didn't think I was going to be able to do this because I've not been well this week, and I have been in some pain, so if I'm not my normal bubbling self, you'll understand why, and forgive me. It's to do with a spinal injury, so in the last few days, every little movement is quite painful. It's really, very painful, but I've taken some painkillers and I should be all right. It's reminded me really of how scary pain and illness are, because normally I'm very well, don't have any problems, but to be ill like that suddenly with intense back pain, like trapped nerve kind of thing, so you can hardly move, it really focuses the mind on what's important, and to me it feels like a metaphor for the world situation. We're in pain as a planet, in a kind of slow agony actually. And I know some people are in denial, some people are saying it's all the government's fault or it's all the fault of whatever. I mean, people are very easy to blame. I think we only have ourselves as an aggregate, as a planet of human beings. I think we have to all admit what we haven't been doing, which is, this is a time for really, profound soul reflection. But I want to bring a ray of light, because this week I've also been active among my circle of friends and fellow muses and philosophers and poets around the world, and I want to focus this week on poetry as a positive thing, because some people know, not many necessarily know, but I started my spiritual and intellectual journey as a poet, and I've never been disloyal to the first muse that awoke me from slumber, and I've been faithful to the poetic muses ever since, and I've written so far 7 volumes in my collected works of poetry, and I'm going to be sharing with you a selection of those today. It's going to be a poetry reading, and I'm going to intersperse it with some comments. So there'll be a poem and a few comments, and we'll see how that goes. I mean, I've given public poetry readings in various places, and obviously we're on lockdown, so it's slightly different here. I began my career and love for poetry really growing up in Brighton. My very earliest memories are in Canada, in Montreal, and that's where I began to learn to write. Went to little preschool type thing, but it was in Brighton, growing up there in the 60s, that I really fell in love with poetry. In the house we had a fantastic library. My parents were quite literate and intellectually active. My mother was a French scholar. She had a lot of books of European poetry, and I would feast on them. I thought discovering these poets like Herbert from Poland, or Neruda from Chile, or you name it, all of them, John Donne, the metaphysical poets. I just fell in love with poetry as a truth-telling project. I was going to Brighton Grammar School at the time and discovered that school education is really more about, just learning specific modalities of thinking, which are very disciplined and rigorous, like maths or physics or the sciences. I found them constrictive. It's like what you have to do with your mind is limited, and just learn to put it through hoops like a kind of training pony. And that didn't sit well with my spirit, which is pretty free-spirited. And I really got on with the English teacher, an old, savant called Jack Smithies, who was a great teacher, who introduced us to Shakespeare and to the mysteries of poetry. And from about the age of 13, I think, I would write poems. Inspired by the landscapes, the countryside around Brighton, the seascapes particularly. We lived in Kemp Town and incredible views of the sea. And I would often go for walks at sunset and dusk and just, it was like your soul was transported to a different realm. And poetry just came forth because having read a lot and studied it, I don't know where it comes from. I still can't say where poetry comes from. It suddenly descends upon one, a poem. And to me, when I later discovered that the Greeks said it came from the goddess, the Muses, that sounds as good as an explanation as anything. And when much later I discovered the Celts said the same, it comes from the Arwen, the mystery, the muse. Okay, so it's like a transpersonal experience to me, writing poetry. It was my first real glimpse of what I would call religious experience. And that poetic intelligence, I think, is what's at stake on this planet. The reason I'm sharing now is because I think we got into this mess as a planet because we've listened too long to the scientists, the economists, the people that reduce everything to numbers and figures, statistics, and who have no soul. They've lost their soul. They've lost their poetry. The problems with the world are that we've lost sight of what we're here for, which is for poetry. And I interpret that in the broadest sense. I mean the creative arts in general, music, dance, bardic work, song. And to me, the greatest philosophers are also poets. The ones I mostly esteem, like Plato. He's a master poet in his own way, a delicious user of irony and humour. Nietzsche is a great poet in his own way. And Aristotle, if you get past the kind of dauntingness of it, is a great weaver of truths with language. I once ploughed through the collected works of Aristotle, and he's a poet too. I mean, just amazing thinker. So basically, what I will ask is that you listen to my poetry, and then by all means, give me some feedback, and hopefully I'll encourage you to write some of your own. Because there's nothing like creating poetry to understand, where it's coming from. Let me just turn that phone off because that's ridiculous. Somebody's ringing me. Right, so God knows where that came from. Can't find the phone, but anyway, hopefully it won't go again. So, I'm going to read the first poem. I'm going to read one from each of my 7 volumes, so it's a bit of a feast. Before I start, I want to just ring the silver bell, because this is a Druid custom. When a poet is in the room or walking along, somebody goes ahead with the silver branch with a little bell attached, and it means a bard is present, a poet is here. So if you don't realise that about me, you do now, I hope. Now, so this is a poem I wrote in Ireland in 1997. This is from volume 1 of my poems. And there are so many I could choose from. I've written, as I say, about 1,000 poems. I can't do justice to them all, but I'm just going to select 7. This I wrote in Ireland when I went to take part in a bardic druidical festival in honour of Lu. It was Lunacer, who is the Celtic god of light, and it's the beginning of August, celebrating his presence. And it was a wonderful pagan retreat centre called Shock Shanra from memory, run by a woman called Chris Thompson with various people. There was a lovely old druid called Adge, who became a friend of mine, and others, some people that had known Gerald Gardner, the founder of Wicca, who was a friend of Ross Nichols, the druid from the early 20th century. And So it was a wonderful gathering, and on this land, there's about 10 or 15 acres of land, they'd planted a tree circle with all the sacred trees from the Celtic alphabet, and also there was a labyrinth made, which you could walk. It was like a shard labyrinth, and you could walk along it, and I did. I mused. I spent a few days at this gathering. I think I read a few poems. We had a wonderful night fire organised by Adge, a great bonfire celebrating Lou. Adge had been at the Battle of the Beanfield, and I interviewed him. He'd escaped, one of the few people not to be arrested, which was about Stonehenge and the politics of accessing Stonehenge for ritual and festival. So it was a marvellous adventure, really. And, oh God. Well, you know, that's the backdrop, guys. We live in a cyber world. So, what I did was I walked the labyrinth and I went into the centre of it. I was alone, and then I wrote the poem down. And this is the poem I wrote in the middle of the labyrinth. Sitting at the point of pure spirit, at the heart of the labyrinth, an apple tree bursts young here, buds thrusting upwards, becoming leaves, fresh each season. She outgrows newly and recanopies green. Here, at the centre point, the tree teaches us growth in stages, building and forming and reforming, zone on zone. Her branches smeared with moss, leprechaun green, loose people behind the fruiting of being, as usual. Wood comes from this, out of slow, patient growth, the water sap rising magically, veined into air by the magnetism of wind and the alchemy of sunlight, outfolding openness to receive, chalice-like. The leaves offered and open, heart-formed, sky-tuned, catching star juice, netting distant stories, recovering interterrestrial, intraterrestrial transmissions of starlight, star stories. The apple seeded through into itself, star-shaped, pentacle core-shaped, Aphrodite's love fruit, burrowed long and ancient. Paris also paused, asked by Zeus to arbitrate between Hera, Athena and Aphrodite in the incident of the golden apple, and considered, offered, given love graciously, gratefully accepting and giving, the cycle of life and love, coming to him as Helen, mysterious, aloof, yet responding, quickening to his exploring touch of mind on mind, of skin on silken soul stuff. Later, the Furies came, jealousies and revenge, kings and ownership, and wounded egos. Grey-bearded, eagle-eyed, meany Menelaus, stirring a storm, and Agamemnon, preparing to sacrifice his own daughter. And nobody thought to ask Helen before the libraries of Troy went down in flames. Here, Ireland awakens itself anew each generation, heart-crossed, star-crossed, imminent underworld, river born, Styx depths, over crossings, 9 waves and further, vanished in mist, beyond, beyond, within. How alien this repository of all the stories of the inmost heart of us, unknown, the lost descent, the vanished writing, the phantom ship, yet inwardly storing the hazel and the fruited apple, green cloaked, the star-frail patient wisdom, girdle of deep tree roots, green soul roots, sweet goddess roots, delving and daring and dying again into the wine, into the sheen of velvet, Dionysian, elfin, light. Okay, that's a poem, a little sort of medium-length poem. Some are longer, some are shorter, which, as I say, I wrote in Ireland. And I've been to Ireland many times, and I think for me, I'm part Irish myself, and for me, rediscovering Ireland was very much like a coming home to a land of poetry. I've always admired Irish poetry and Yeats and the many poets of Ireland, going right back to the Bronze Age. There is an unbroken tradition of poetry in Ireland, which is one of the oldest in Europe. It's as old as Homer. Obviously there are references to Homer in that poem, who's one of my great, inspirers, and I've had the honour to go to places in Greece associated with him. And also to Troy, which also comes up in that poem. So anyway, there's lots there to feast on. I want to just say a little bit about my understanding of the links between poetry and philosophy, because, as you know, I'm also a philosopher. And, what am I most? Am I a poet or a philosopher? Well, to me, they're the same. They're the same mission. They just are expressed and achieved in slightly different modalities. And to me, philosophy is an attempt in prose, sometimes in poetry. I mean, some philosophers have actually written in poetry. Parmenides wrote, a great tract which Karl Popper commented on nature, which is a poem dedicated to the goddess. And it seems that the very first pre-Socratic philosophers were poet, sage, shaman figures dedicated to the worship of Apollo, who were using we call consciousness transformation techniques, and Parmenides was in that lineage. So in my studies, very, very early on, I fell in love with poetry, as I've said, and I started writing. But I also fell in love with philosophy a bit later, when I discovered it existed. I didn't know there was such a thing as philosophy at first. It was like a secret. And I discovered books, and I explored my parents' library. I discovered Spinoza, I remember. The thought of Spinoza trying to crack the code of ethics, I found incredibly poetic. And when I researched more, I then went to apply to study philosophy at university, thinking that I was setting out on an adventure of uncovering the mysteries, like Parmenides or whatever. What I didn't realise, and it was a bit of a rude awakening when I got to university, was how unpoetic most teachers regard philosophy as. I think I'm in a minority among philosophers, because most philosophers see their job as kind of screwing a few nuts and bolts onto the mechanism of science. And they take as read the materialist presuppositions of post-scientific revolutionary intellectual life, and regard poetry as a fantasy. I mean, Darwin apparently could not read poetry, he just hated it. There was no poetry in his soul, and that, I think, is the problem with modern science. That's where biowarfare technicians are trained to have no soul, that they can do this gain of function research, get paid millions, and that's fine. They don't seem to have a conscience, these people, or the nuclear weapons machinery creators who've been, they're threatening to destroy my world and our world and your world, and now we're all on lockdown because of these scientists whose word is completely meaningless. There's no veracity in them either, and we know from Robert Kennedy his exposure of the vaccination racket that's going on. It's scandalous to me, and my diagnosis is it's because they lack poetry. You see, they obviously skip their lessons in school because poetry forces you to confront your conscience in a still small voice. And a lot of the great religious texts of humanity, I would say actually all of them, are also in poetry. When I read the Bible, when I read the Quran, when I read the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Buddhist sutras, the Celtic scriptures and so on, they're all poetry of different sorts. So that's what I wanted to do by studying philosophy. I wanted to find the poetic kernel at the heart of all these philosophical systems. Unfortunately, academia in the West, in Britain at that time and in America, had been taken over by a gang of intellectual destructivists who want to banish poetry from the playing field and regard it as not proper knowledge. So they invented this thing called logical positivism, which literally shuts you up if you start talking about anything they call metaphysics, right? So basically I resigned from academia, that first experience. It was horrendous, in order to become a wandering poet. And I walked to Stonehenge with a pack on my back one beautiful May morning, and I resigned from that kind of academia, which I regard as obstructionist and destructivist, and it's anti-poetry, right? So, and I went off to Canada to study in my own way as an independent student at the University of Calgary, where I read through all the great religious and poetic and theological texts of all the different spiritual traditions and lineages. That's where I read the Bible for the first time, in depth, cover to cover, all the Apocrypha. I read the entire Quran and the commentaries, the writings by great Islamic scholars. And it's where I read the Talmud, or parts of it, and the rabbinical commentaries and the Zohar, the Kabbalah and so on. And it was like lights were going off in my soul, because I realised these great sages of humanity, they're all inspired poets. And we have so much more in common than people realise. There's no need, therefore, for religious warfare, say in the Middle East or in Britain and Scotland and wherever. All the wars of history are a poetic mistake. That's the conclusion I came to after 4 years of intense study in Canada, where my parents had, obviously I was born there, and they had been mixing with some famous Canadian poets when I was a little boy. Miriam Waddington, Leonard Cohen was part of that circle in Montreal, who became famous when he started playing his songs to guitar. And Canada is a poetic country. I love Canada because of that, the tremendous skies, the snow, the changing seasons. And I would have happily settled there for the rest of my life, but I came back to London in the early 80s to launch Philosophers and Historians for Peace. And to, because that work I'd done for 4 years, which revealed to me the incredible unity behind apparent cultural conflict diversity, can only be resolved at that higher level, that angelic level, or the level of the muse. So that got me writing, and I was working and writing poetry at the same time. So I'm going to read a poem from volume 2, which is again a poem about, this time it's called The Questing Beast, which is an image from Arthurian traditions. I threw myself into studies in London into the Druidical tradition at the heart of the British Tudor period, John Dee, the mysteries. I did a history degree at the University of London because I'd done enough philosophy. I knew that, but I wanted to know the details of modern history, world history. So I studied from 1500 on, in depth, world and European history and intellectual history. And I also carried on with my writing, and this is one of the poems I wrote at that time. It was from 2002, actually. The Questing Beast. The questing beast, it leads us on, with 40 baying whelps within her myriad heads, connected fibres of perplexity. The questing beast, like all of us, an offspring of the devil-tempted female shaman, inexpressible and lost. The beast may lead us out of here, may lead us out of hell, and back again, returned and resurrected, dumbed down before the moon, no sooner seen than vanishing, scripts, collages, woven texts of sex and teeth, puncturing, collating. So spread a net of vowels to catch the questing beast, like wind. Unfurl the heart, its nothingness at core, one with the beast. So caught and held within this giddying embrace of love and ecstasy that's tumbling onwards. Who is hunter now? Who is the questing beast? Did Palamedes find a clue? Did Palamedes know, only to have his sword knocked from him, his violence and his pagan soul so sheer with love, like poising on the highest cliff and swooning to the sun for her? Then it's taken, only glimpses, voices, mouth, an echo, glimming blackness, stutterings. So even if we found it, found the beast, we couldn't say. We'd murmur dimly, muttering, yet don't forget, always the quest continues, beyond any fixity, beyond any furthest star system, outer, inner, moment by moment, the dance of time, the music of the game of self and other intertwined, in lusting hurtfulness that wounds itself by losing self, becoming beauty, catching a glint on sea of moon. When we abandon finally the chase, surrender, love, the questing beast finds us, comes out to play, gives peace. Okay, so that's a rather mysterious poem, but it's if you're into study of imagery and stuff, you can unpiece it. A lot of my poems are in kind of code. I've been greatly inspired by, well, the whole history of the canon of poetry that I've, grazed on, but the metaphysical poets were inspiring to me, John Donne and people. Okay, so I want to talk about something else briefly, because to me poetry also includes drama, and I was always, well, since I discovered Shakespeare, I've always been a fan of the Bard of Avon and the poetry of Shakespeare and the plays. And I've written a play myself, which I would love to see performed, about the end of the world, which seems quite appropriate actually, on lockdown here, as a planet. I'd like to see that play performed. It's a bit of a rush really, if we can get it performed before the end of the world. The whole play, the conceit of the play is it's organised by the gods, Dionysus, who's the god of theatre, Gaia, and the chorus of the nine muses. They're putting on a play to prevent the destruction of the world. And the question is, can we get this play performed in time? I used to act in Brighton when I was growing up. I was an audition for the National Youth Theatre, and I had, I was in various Shakespeare plays and stuff. And recently I listened to a really interesting interview with Derek Jacobi and Mark Rylance talking about the Shakespeare authorship declaration. They as two great actors, have come to the conclusion, along with hundreds of other people, that Will Shakespeare from Stratford can't have written all the great oeuvre of Shakespearean plays. This is a thing I've been interested in since discovering there's a bit of a mystery here many years ago, and spending months and months researching it in the British Library, as one does, and the London Library. And there are questions to ask. I mean, for instance, why is there a book in Francis Bacon's collection with all kinds of words that got jotted into Shakespeare's plays? My theory about that is that Bacon and Shakespeare were friends. They had a great intellectual love affair, if you want, and when you love somebody, you copy, borrow words and stuff. So maybe Bacon was copying some words from Shakespeare, or vice versa. There are other people who have influenced the plays, Earl of Oxford and so on. Who knows? It's a mystery, and all Rylance and Jacobi are saying is let's investigate. They take the view that Will Shakespeare had very little to do with it, the man from Stratford. I'm not so sure myself. I think that Will Shakespeare was something to do with it, and one of the things they argue about is, well, he can't have written them. He never went abroad. He never went to Italy, and a lot of the plays are set in Italy and France. Well, that appears not to be true. It appears that Will Shakespeare from Stratford did go to Italy. There's an entry of his in the English College in Rome for visiting Catholic scholars, and in the library in the English College at Rome, which has been going since Anglo-Saxon times. It used to be used by kings when they're visiting Rome. They would stay in the English College. It has a great library, and it has the old visitors' books from the 16th century, and Will Shakespeare wrote his name. Apparently he visited. Okay, so Will Shakespeare's father seems to have been a Catholic in secret, and that inspired him with a love of Europe, a love of romance and adventure. And in those days, being a Catholic was pretty dangerous in Elizabethan England. You were lucky if you weren't captured, tortured and racked, which is why he doesn't do many plays about Christianity. He avoids all that stuff. I suspect that Shakespeare was he was probably loyal to the Anglican Catholic branch of the spiritual mysteries, and he regarded himself both a Catholic and an Anglican, which is kind of my position, actually. Although I'm a bit more complicated because I'm also a Sufi and a Kabbalist and a Druid and so on. I don't think Shakespeare had access to all the full range of religious knowledge we do now. Even though Sir Walter Raleigh did in the Tower, writing his History of the World, he puts a lot of knowledge in there. And John Dee did as well. So, there were people with tremendous knowledge. I think Shakespeare probably met Dee. I think it inspired his Prospero. But there are mysteries. So anyway, listen to the wonderful talk. Derek Jacobi, who I love as an actor, who played the Cadfael mysteries, written by Ellis Peters from Shropshire, where I lived happily for many years. They're saying, let's look at this. Now, to me, why does it matter that there's a Shakespeare mystery? I think he represents the soul of Britain. The Bard of Britain is not a misnomer. And in his plays, there is a witness to peace and to the folly of power struggles. In the history plays, there is this, the dread of the folly of kings as they battle for status and position. I acted in Richard II, as a young man, and also Macbeth. I mean, these are great stories about the folly of hubris. Hubris being arrogance, and it leads to violence. Macbeth, is brought down by his inability to stand up for truth, which has permeated even to his inner household. His wife has become a demoness. And so I think, yes, there's still a lot to learn from Shakespeare and from the study of those plays. And for me as a philosopher, Shakespeare was a great,